In a sense, I think there's a good deal of possibility that America is in what might classically be called a pre-revolutionary situation. And then there really might be, sort of dramatic changes in American society that happen only very rarely in the country. In the last 20 or 30 years, really 40 years, there's been a tremendous polarization of wealth in the United States. In other words, most ordinary Americans have shown little, if any, economic improvement in 30 or 40 years, which is unprecedented in American society. In other words, for hundreds of years, Americans had always been more prosperous than their parents, more prosperous than the grandparents. And that stopped about 30 or 40 years ago. So Americans these days, in many cases, are poorer than their parents were. They're poorer than their grandparents were, and are certainly not growing, not doing well economically anymore. While on the other hand, the tiny elite wealthy class of American society, the top 1%, the top 2%, maybe the top 5%, is getting incredibly wealthy by comparison. And there's a widespread feeling that much of that wealth has been acquired parasitically. In other words, it's basically that a tiny section of the American public has been getting much wealthier by really extracting wealth from the rest of the country and making the rest of the country much poorer, which, is the sort of thing that in many countries in the last hundreds of years has led to a revolution. In other words, when you have a tiny elite getting wealthier and wealthier, and the bulk of the population doing worse and worse over time, at some point things might boil over and you might see basically, a violent clash. And so the fact that, that particular executive was assassinated by somebody, outraged over the wealth that he and his company were extracting from the American public. I mean, that's a very dangerous indicator because, the fact that so much of the American public endorsed what he was doing. I mean, there's such a tremendous dissatisfaction over a lot of these corporations, with the healthcare sector being a perfect example of it. In other words, we're talking about basically, I think America spends something like 17 or 18% of its entire GDP on healthcare. And we have some of the worst healthcare results in the world. In other words, the average Chinese person lives longer than the average American. I mean, America is still a much wealthier country, but the Chinese life expectancy is now longer. And, Chinese are much healthier than Americans. They're doing much better than Americans. And the same thing is certainly true of America's European allies. In other words, if you look at, for example, a chart showing the amount of money America is spending on healthcare and the life expectancy, we're diverging from all of our European allies. And so, if we're spending all of this money and we're not getting any results for it, and, ordinary people are sometimes driven into bankruptcy or destroyed economically because their health insurance provider refused to cover the cost of their, services. I mean, that makes people very, very angry. And, I think we're seeing the tip of the iceberg. When you look at, for example, the health problems in the United States, obesity is a gigantic problem. Much of it caused probably because of the lobbying of corporations to encourage the government to support, eating certain food products rather than other food products. And so we're talking about an incredibly corrupt society. I mean, in other words, when you're talking about micro-corruption, in other words, in most parts of the United States, if you get a ticket from the police, you can't bribe the police. If you try that, you'll go to prison. If you try doing, for example, you can't bribe people about zoning permits. America has very little micro-corruption, but it has gigantic macro-corruption. Corruption on the topmost level. Corruption, on, for example, the national security level, with so much of our money going to these defense contractors who, in a sense, are paying off the government official. I mean, right now, America's spending probably $1 trillion a year on defense, and we can't build artillery shells. We don't have the industrial capacity to build artillery shells. I mean, our planes, we're talking about planes that don't fly very well. The F-35 has all sorts of problems, and we've spent $1 trillion a year on defense. So, I mean, that's a perfect example of why, I'm talking about macro corruption.
偷偷告诉大家，我最近发现了新法宝 Royal Face 逆时奇迹系列，它有活肤露、全效精华，还有精华霜。尤其我皮肤比较偏干，所以我非常的注重保湿。保湿做得好，肌肤自然烹饪。提亮肤色更年轻，抚平皱纹超有感，而且气色变好。用心保养，每天都更美一点。 美吧。